My father was the youngest of 10 children. He was born in the United States, in Brownsville, Brooklyn. His parents came from Galicia and came to the United States in 1907. Our last name is Schacter. My grandfather, Rabbi, was the last of 7 generations of Shochtim, hence our last name Schacter, and my father was the first one to break the train. He was born and raised into a very traditional Jewish home. He went to local yeshivot in Brooklyn, and already at the age of 6, 7, 8, represented himself as a child prodigy and as a speaker. His elementary school, Yeshiva Chaim Berlin, put him on a chair in front of hundreds of people when he was 7 or 8 to speak at the dinners of the yeshiva in order to raise money on their behalf. My father told me, and we later found that it was corroborated, that when he was 8, he was put on a chair under chupot and gave the rashot to the chatan and the kala under the chuppah. It's hard for me to imagine what he would say to a chatan and kala at the age of 8, standing on a chair under their chuppah. But it speaks to the respect that he had already as a young boy, as a speaker, as an orator, as someone who would have what to contribute. For high school, he went to Masifta Torah V'das and began to realize that he could make a contribution to the world Jewish community best if he were to attend Yeshivat Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan and Yeshiva College, where he would be able to get a first-rate education both in Limudei Kodesh and also in Limudei Chol. He went off to college, graduated in 1938 from Yeshiva College, and decided that he wanted to be a rabbi. He went to study for smicha with Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, who was then the Rosh Yeshiva. But at the end of 1940, Dr. Revel, who was the president of the yeshiva, died. At the beginning of 1941, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, died. And there was a tremendous mashber in the yeshiva at the time. Both heads of the yeshiva were no longer alive. And my father was in line for smicha, but there was no one to administer the bechinot for him. It was at that time, a few months later, when Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, Rabbi Yosef Dov Hagrid Soloveitchik, took over for his father. And my father was the first one to get smicha from Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. There were a group of boys who were waiting to move up. My father was the first one. For us, that's been a source of tremendous pride, because Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, where just commemorated his 20th yortzeit on Chol HaMoed Pesach, gave smicha l'rabbanut to more rabbis than anyone else in Jewish history. Something like 2,500 rabbis he signed on the smicha l'rabbanut. And my father was the first. And because of that, my father had a very close and warm and deep relationship with Rabbi Soloveitchik over all of the years. Rabbi Soloveitchik was the Misader Kiddushin at my wedding when I was married to my wife, even though I was not a student of his, but he did it because of his relationship with my father. When my sister was married, she was married before us. Rabbi Soloveitchik was Misader Kiddushin, her and her husband, as an expression of the closeness that he felt to our father. Shortly thereafter, he enlisted in the army. World War II is now in full force. At the end of 1941, the United States is engaged. And my father told me always that he wanted to do whatever he could to help Jews and to fight the Nazis. He became a chaplain in the United States Army, spent some time in the United States, traveling from place to place. And then when it was time for him to go overseas, they wanted to send him to Paris. And he said, no, I'm not going to Paris, I'm going to Germany. I want to be in the best position that I could be in order to help Jews. He was in the front lines of the American Army with General Patton and was the first Army chaplain, certainly the first Jewish Army chaplain, to enter the concentration camp of Buchenwald on April 11th, 1945. He spoke about this for his entire life. What he saw and what he experienced and what he did emblazoned themselves onto his mind and threw him into the mind of my sister and myself as children growing up, and to so many audiences that he reached across the United States and across the world. He told us himself many stories, and we actually found out a few things after he became ill and could no longer share stories with us, and even at the Shiva. There were two individuals who he saved in Buchenwald, who came to be Menachem Aval, our family, and told us in very heartrending ways the impact that our father had on them. One of them came in to the Shiva, he sat down, he started to cry, and he said, "Your father was the Mashiach. Ha'aba shalcha mamash haya ha'mashiach b'shvilei." Zaya ma'od ma'od meragesh, was very, very powerful and very emotional for us. He left the American Army at some point and moved into Buchenwald. I would say that those months that he spent were the foundational core narratives of his life's experience. He did a lot after that, and I'm happy to share that and look forward to sharing that with you. But that was, I think, really the core that represented an extraordinary contribution that he made in moments of deep neediness on the part of many, many Jews, and what positioned him, I think, internally to take on very significant leadership positions in the world Jewish community afterwards. I'll just share one story. There are many, many stories. There was a young Baba V'chassid in camp who had given up his faith in the Ribono Shel Olam. He was, I believe at that time, 16 years old. He lost his mother and his father and his brothers and his sisters and his aunts and his uncles and his cousins. I believe 60 members of his family were killed by the Nazis. He was the only one left. My father took a liking to him, being the youngest of 10 children, being raised in a European household. My father spoke Yiddish very well for his entire life. And he took a liking to boys that he felt comfortable with. He helped hundreds of young boys and girls in Buchenwald, but some of them, somehow there was a special kesher. This young boy wanted nothing to do with God or with the Jewish people. This young boy was Mechalel Shabbat, Ochel Tarfut, Lo Ichpat Lo Klum, בעניינים שנוגעים לדת, לאלוקים, לתורה, לכלל ישראל, אפס. And my father organized a kinder transport of children to leave Buchenwald. One of the things that he did many, to go to Switzerland. And he invited this young fellow to go with him, but he didn't want to go. He wanted to marry a Schacter. He wanted to live in Weimar. Weimar was the name of the German town right next to Buchenwald. He had it. He was finished with Judaism. And my father respected that. What can you say? We have a number of stories of his connection to people who publicly articulated their rejection of the traditional lives within which they lived. And we could certainly understand that. So my father said to him, I know you want to stay, you'll stay, you're a big boy. But we're leaving on Tuesday, and come say goodbye. I'm going to be leaving with the other, mostly children, not only children, and I'm never going to see you again. We have a nice relationship. I like you, you like me. Come to the train station to say goodbye. So this young man came, and on the morning that the train was going to leave, he spent some time on the train station. The Swiss government sent a train and sent a nurse and sent 200 passes for 200 children below the age of 16 to be allowed into Switzerland. My father understood very well that there were many more than 200 young people, and that there were those who were not children who needed to be able to be helped. There was somebody in the camp who was a printer, who survived the concentration camps as a printer, with whom my father had a very close relationship. This individual was a central person in our lives growing up, became a Ben Bayit. And this person went into town and he forged another 200 passes. The morning came. There was a woman with a baby. And my father snuck her onto the train and locked her into the bathroom and said to her, L'man Hashem, don't you dare open the door for anybody. Her great-grandson came to our house to be Menachem Avel. That woman now has 150 descendants, most of whom live in Israel, who are Emunei Shlomei Yisrael, who are very much part of the Jewish people and the Jewish community, particularly in Israel. The nurse begins to realize something crazy is going on because there are many more than 200 people who are getting onto this train. But somehow they all get onto the train. Train's ready to leave, and this young 16-year-old is waving goodbye. My father leans over, grabs him by the hand, pulls him onto the train, and slams the door. He was extremely angry. I remember how my father described this story. My father was kidnapping a young boy. He's old enough to do what he wants. And my father kidnapped him, pulled him onto the train. He's screaming, he's yelling, how can you do this to me? I told you I didn't want to go. B'kitzur, what's he going to do? He's on the train. The train's moving. They come to the Swiss border, and the Swiss government didn't want to let the train in. The nurse radioed ahead that Rabbi Schacter violated the agreement. The agreement was for 200 young people. They're double that at least on this train. The Swiss government didn't want to let the train in. I remember my father telling us many times how he was a short man, my father. Very powerful, but short. He said he got up as tall as he could, and he told the Swiss authorities that if they don't let the train in, he's going to call a press conference, and he's going to make an international incident to draw attention to the fact that the Swiss government is being so cruel and so insensitive, not to allow another few broken, shattered Jewish children to come into their country and to give them a chance after everything that they went through. There was a standoff for a while, and then they backed down, and the train went into Switzerland. They come to a DP camp, a displaced person camp in Switzerland, and it's Shabbat. Shabbat morning, they didn't have a problem getting a minyan. For sure, not everybody was interested in a minyan. There were those, many Jews who were not traditional, and there were many Jews who were traditional who were no longer traditional. But then came Mincha, Shabbat Mincha, and they had 9 men, 9 boys to make a minyan. And my father went out looking to find a minyan, and he saw this young fellow smoking a cigarette. And he said to him, "We need you to make a minyan." The fellow said to him, "You need to make a minyan. I don't need to make a minyan. I'm finished. Minyan bishvili lo meshaneh bichlal." My father said, I know for you don't need a minyan, but there are 9 people who need a minyan. Mate. Just stand there. Stand there. Just stand there. Don't bother. So he throws down his cigarette. He comes in. He stands in the back, and now it's time for Kriyat Torah. Nobody knows Kriyat Torah. This young fellow knew Kriyat Torah. My father went over to him. He said, "We need you to lane." He said, "You need a lane. I don't need to lane. Doesn't mean anything to me." My father said, "I know, but otherwise there's no Kriyat Torah. Don't do it for you. Do it for them." He walked up, and he started to lay. And he told me in 1963, when I met him for the first time, he told me that when he started to lay, the letters of the Sefer Torah jumped out at him and grabbed a hold of him, and after that, never let go. It was about 10 years ago when a grandchild of his was married. The chuppah that they used was the chuppah that my father carried around as an American Army chaplain in Buchenwald. Jewish chaplains had a kit. They had sidurim, they had tefillin, they had a chuppah. You never know. You run into a soldier, he wants to get married. My father held on to that little makeshift, tiny chuppah. And that was the chuppah that they used at the grandson of this young boy. And my father had a bracha under the chuppah. Today there are about 100 people in this family. And they live in different countries, and a very substantial percentage live in Israel. It's in the schut of my father that all these nefashot are now part of Klal Yisrael and not alienated from Klal Yisrael. We have many, many stories, but this was a very foundational moment for him in his life. When he came back to the United States, this is before I was born, before he was married, he traveled across the United States, North America, and Canada, speaking and telling his story. He wore his army uniform. And he spent 2 years traveling, telling the story. He was married to our mother in 1948. He started his rabbinic career as a rabbi in Stamford, Connecticut, for a little while before he went off to the army. They held the position for him. When he came back from the army, he wasn't interested in going back to be the rabbi in Stamford, Connecticut. He traveled, and then he became the rabbi of the Marshall Jewish Center in the Bronx, and remained the rabbi of the Marshall Jewish Center in the Bronx for over 50 years. And had a tremendous impact on dozens and dozens and dozens of families. This was a time when the Bronx was traditional but not really observant, and there were many, many young men and women who grew up in his shul. And he convinced their parents, who were very sweet people, but not really traditional people, he convinced them to send their boys and girls to yeshiva. And there are hundreds and hundreds of people, 1, 2, 3 generations later, many living in Israel. We got calls and calls and calls from wonderful friends living in Israel and outside of Israel who acknowledged the impact that he had on their lives and set them in the direction of traditional Jewish life.